Hello everyone, welcome to this month's edition of Ben's Book Club. We are so excited to have our director, Dr. Marcia Balaciano, in conversation with Dr. Andrew Jackson O'Shaughnessy, and we're really delighted that he's going to be talking about his new book today. I'll hand over to Marcia to introduce Andrew. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Eleanor. And just a word, Eleanor is our very talented education manager and does an amazing job of bringing the story of the house alive to young people, both primary school children and beyond. Well, I am absolutely delighted to welcome Andrew O'Shaughnessy to this Ben's Book Club. And I wanted to tell you a little bit about Andrew. He has been a friend of Benjamin Franklin House since even before we opened to the public. He's found lots of ways to be incredibly supportive to us and to contribute to the intellectual capital of the house. And tonight is not an exception. Andrew is the vice president of Monticello, and he's also the Saunders director of the Robert H. Smith International Center for Jefferson Studies at the Thomas Jefferson Foundation. And he's also a professor of history at the University of Virginia. He's the author of An Empire Divided, The American Revolution and the British Caribbean, which was published by University of Pennsylvania Press in 2000. And of course, there's always a Franklin connection to everything. And Franklin is credited with the founding of Penn. His most recent book, prior to the one we're going to be talking about tonight, The Men Who Lost America, British Leadership, the American Revolution, and the Fate of the Empire, was published by Yale University Press in 2013, and it received 8 national awards, including the New York Historical Society American History Book Prize, the George Washington Book Prize, and the Society of Military History Book Prize. But tonight we're going to be talking about the illimitable freedom of the human mind, Thomas Jefferson's idea of a university. So I wanted to just give you a flavor for how the book has been received. So it will encourage each one of you to make sure you get your copy. So according to Annette Gordon-Reed of Harvard University, who's author of The Hemmingses of Monticello, An American Family, she says it's a great contribution to the literature, both on Jefferson and on the University of Virginia. O'Shaughnessy challenges recent scholarship on Jefferson and the history of the university's founding and explicates Jefferson's thinking and plans for a university, the Commonwealth of Virginia, and the nation. Wow. I also want to highlight another great scholar and author, John Meacham, who's author of Thomas Jefferson, The Art of Power, who says of the Thomas Jefferson's idea of a university as a living monument to the efficacy of reason and to the pursuit of justice in a fallen world. Thomas Jefferson's University of Virginia is an essential American institution. In this landmark and illuminating work, Andrew O'Shaughnessy is a wonderful guide into the world of Jefferson's thoughts and deeds on the question of education, an undertaking the author of the Declaration of Independence knew to be vital for the creation and the preservation of democracy itself. And if you'll just let me tell you one more, because this person is very important to us at Benjamin Franklin House, a lady named Barbara Oberg, in a previous guise. She's now at Princeton University, but she was one of the editors of the papers of Benjamin Franklin at Yale University. And she says, in this well-researched and skillfully crafted history of the University of Virginia, O'Shaughnessy explores the origins of Jefferson's ideals for the university and gives us a fresh and important way of understanding them. Jefferson, a visionary man of the Enlightenment and lover of books, created the library and chose the curriculum for his university. Jefferson, the architect, designed and supervised the construction of the physical foundations for his academical village. Both of these were crucial to the fulfillment of his lifelong commitment to an illimitable freedom of the mind. So I think I should get on and let you say hello, Andrew.
Hello. thank you very much indeed for hosting me. I remember that my very first public book talk after the publication of my last book was at the Franklin House. I'm sorry we can't be together in person today, but it's wonderful to be appearing on your podcast.
Well, I wanted to ask you first, why did you decide to write about the idea of a university? We know, given your important role that you play at Monticello, that Jefferson is going to feature very large in your thoughts on any given day, but why about the university?
Well, originally my interest was stimulated when I arrived at Monticello, which is years ago. The time has passed quickly. And I read a short book, it was just a little over 100 pages by Gary Wills, who's a sort of public intellectual, called Miss Jefferson's University. And it was written from secondary sources, but it was a nice little digest. And it really whet my appetite to know a great deal more. And I was impressed by the creativity of his vision and felt that we might even learn more today and that this would be useful as a model to discuss when we think about university education in our present era. I was also very aware after several years that this was a topic that had been largely neglected and just treated as an epilogue to his career. And yet this is a period for which we have the best archives and best descriptions of Jefferson and the most detailed information. It's quite inspiring as a story in that between the age of 73 and 83, he was intimately involved in every aspect of creating a university. As a lawyer, he drafted all the bills to create the university. As an architect, he designed the buildings. As very much an intellectual, he prescribed the syllabus. As a bibliophile, he listed all the books for the library, over 6,000 titles, which immediately became the second largest university library in the United States. He even supervised the building and dealt with a lot of minutiae, taking the minutes of the governing board. And this is a remarkable feat for someone of that age. It would still be today. And I cannot think of any head of state in any era of history who has been so intimately involved in the creation of a university and has had the vision. There are very few lay or more ordinary people even who've had this kind of level of role. Generally, founders were royal patrons in Europe and delegated a lot of the detail and implementation to others. So it's a fascinating story and all the more important because it's not been told. And I think it's an important topic because he believed that the functioning of what was then called Republican government, that has morphed into a more democratic system, he believed that his survival would be based on citizens being well educated and holding government accountable and being involved in elections. And I should say that the university was just the apex of his educational vision. He wanted to create a public school system, which would have been the first genuine public school system in the world.
So Andrew, when we think about what he was trying to achieve, can you summarize, practically, what was his idea of university, and how did it differ from other universities that existed? I mean, it was a time when there weren't that many of them, or there weren't that many of them on, formerly colonial, now fledgling United States soil.
So the key difference from other universities in America was that it was secular. And other universities had tried to separate church and state, especially public universities, but it eventually relented before the University of Virginia was founded. Jefferson was obsessed in implementing his idea of the separation of church and state. The university had no chapel and it had no theology. Religious works were discussed in subjects like history and philosophy. They were not so separately dealt with, and students were not required to attend religious services. This was a huge difference from the rest of the United States. On average, students were required to go to chapel twice a day at other colleges. So that was one thing that distinguished it and really anticipated the modern university. His emphasis on broad curriculum that included vocational subjects like law and medicine, as well as science and new fields like economics. That was a distinguishing feature that anticipated the modern university. It was virtually the first university in America to teach science and modern languages. The majority of other universities were still very much based on the classic. And indeed, as late as 1828, Yale produced a report, and Yale was by far the most influential university in America. It had trained the largest number of presidents of American universities. And the Yale report really doubled down on teaching people the classics, resisting the introduction of the sciences. When they did introduce sciences at Yale, they put them in a separate Sheffield school, and the students were forced to sit in a separate and inferior place in chapel.
I'm glad I didn't have to go to chapel twice a day when I went to university. But let me ask you,
especially in the early hours of the morning, which
yes,
is usually before 8 o'clock.
Yes, and in New England, being very cold in the winter without the heating that we're used to. Tell me about the name of the book. Where did the phrase come from? Illimitable. It's hard to say, Andrew. You got us working on our vocabulary here, but illimitable freedom, where does that come from?
So that is a quote from Jefferson, and it's a quote that continues: "We must follow truth wherever it may lead, based on factual information and reason." And the press, I have to say, tried to dissuade me from that title. They said no one will be able to pronounce the term. The reason I like it is that it gives you this sense of limitlessness and opens the imagination. Partly I'm interested in modern educators looking at this book and using it to stimulate their own ideas and thinking. Imagine, as a decision maker, being able to create the university from scratch. What would you have? What would you do? And so it's really, hopefully, to engage the imagination and emotions of those looking at the title and is subtitled Thomas Jefferson's Idea of a University. And that is a deliberate plagiarism from Ronald Newman, who wrote a book called The Idea of a University. And it remains, oddly, I think, it remains regarded as a classic on liberal arts education, even though Newman was suggesting quite the opposite to the direction of most universities. For him, theology was central. And he felt that that mother of all disciplines, and that a university without theology and religion was not a university.
So do you think that he actually achieved his goal of creating a place that helped to foster that freedom of the mind?
I do, but I'm going against the current grain at the university, and some of the professors written on this tangentially, because they would argue it ended up teaching the leadership of the Confederacy, and that was obviously a bad thing, and that these alumni eventually became spokespeople for slavery and for secession. What I think is interesting is it was virtually the only university in the South that had any tradition of anti-slavery and debate about slavery right up almost until the time of the Civil War. And the main student societies were due to host an abolition just a year before Lincoln's election, and it was the faculty who intervened to prevent them from doing so. And that, I think, is partly a legacy of Jefferson's own anti-slavery thought. By the time of the Civil War, especially with the appointment of two professors in the 1850s, it had indeed become what the Slavery Commission report here at the University of Virginia described as a laboratory of pro-slavery thinking. But this ignores so many of the other achievements. It wasn't just leaders of the Confederacy that the university trained. It was leaders in every aspect of Southern life. The university became known simply as the university, and that title lasted until well after the Civil War. And they dominated fields like medicine, education, and law in the South throughout the antebellum period. That's the period before the Civil War. Jefferson also put great stress on hiring the very best faculty that he could obtain. Interestingly, he obtained most of them from Britain, and he actually sent a representative to Britain and gave him a fabulous list of people to look up and to get advice from. And they brought back 5 of the first 8 professors at the university. Only one of the professors was American born, which, given that we think of Jefferson as the great nationalist, and often people assume he was very anti-British, it's quite telling that his argument was excellence and to hire the best of the best. He argued that Harvard and Yale had a longer history, they'd had more, and the best way to quickly catch up and even overtake them, which was his great hope, was to recruit the best faculty. He introduced the first exams at universities in the United States. And that, of course, maintained standards at the university. It was very important that it be a public university. It was one of the first two universities in America to receive funding every year from the state. And although it was inadequate, the funding they received to achieve all his goals, one of which was to have many scholarships for students who did not have the means otherwise to attend college. Although it didn't give that amount of money, it gave far more proportionally to the budget of the university than the modern day state of Virginia. And then the buildings themselves are so attractive. He described his idea as creating an academical village, was the term he used. And he didn't want to have a main building like other universities, but really a village of buildings that would create a community with professors interspersed among the students and living among them. It was the most expensive building project, public building project at the time, other than building of Washington, D.C. and the Erie Canal, certainly more than any other university in America. And it's all the more remarkable that he did this in the midst of a depression in Virginia, the 1819 depression, which also affected Britain, was one of the worst depressions that Virginia had faced since before the American Revolution in the early 1770s. And one of the things the book really shows are Jefferson's consummate political skills in his late life, in that he was able to have the university adopted and really get everything he wanted in the teeth of opposition. And despite the fact that his desire to have a secular university went very much against the grain at the time, which was increasingly evangelical.
Well, Andrew, let me just remind our listeners that they can post questions in the chat function, which I'm going to look at. Let me ask you, our person is, of course, Benjamin Franklin. And do you know if he ever spoke with Franklin about his educational ideas?
Sadly, I don't. And I was more disappointed still to find out that he didn't seem to have any of Franklin's pamphlets on education. And Franklin, I think I was saying to you while we were off air, someone should do a book on Franklin and education, because he was one of the most interesting figures in terms of his ideas. And he actually was founding a university even before the American Revolution, a generation ahead of Jefferson. Although he didn't found it singly like Jefferson, he was a very important part of the creation of the University of Pennsylvania. To his disappointment, the university became very different from what he had wanted, and he lost control of the project. What is fascinating about Franklin is he wanted to dispense with the requirement of learning the classics and wanted the university to teach vocational subjects. And it seems to me impossible that Jefferson could not have been aware of Franklin's views on public education. To a large extent, Franklin was a role model for Jefferson, especially as ambassador in Paris, ambassador to France. But many of Franklin's ideas complement those of Jefferson. Franklin was ahead of Jefferson in one aspect, that Franklin was active in trying to found a school for African Americans. And it was actually realized here in Virginia, remarkably, in Williamsburg, and it functioned for about a decade. And Jefferson, when asked about funding African-American schools, argued very interestingly, given that his racial views suggested he didn't believe in the mixing of races, that it would be wrong to found separate schools, that they should be integrated. And that African Americans should get, free African Americans, it should be emphasized, should go to the same school as the whites, which does not chime with his otherwise stated views on race. But he certainly knew the University of Pennsylvania, and in the 1790s, he thought it was the best university in America. He reversed that view before he died because he felt it had become too nepotistic and there was too much patronage going on in faculty appointments. And he may have been right to some extent, but he would have certainly been aware of the tradition of medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. And the medical school was a very important part of his vision and was extremely innovative, and again anticipated many modern ideas about Jefferson, and Jefferson specifically repudiated the bloodletting tradition of Benjamin Rush and his students. He was appalled by it, even though he was a friend of Benjamin Rush in Philadelphia. And he thought they were guilty for more murders rather than actually helping people. He had a very modern idea that essentially medicine should not intervene with patients unless there was extremely good empirical evidence for the effectiveness of what they were doing.
Yeah. Well, let me, before I go to a question that we received, so they may not have, we don't have the historical record that tells us that they had a conversation about education, but I wonder if you could just say something about, you mentioned how Jefferson really looked up to Franklin, and I was always struck when I went to Monticello about this kind of wall of honor in one of the beautiful spaces, and Jefferson has chosen some of the people that he feels are important to him and to the development of the world. And Franklin is one of them. I wonder if you could speak to that, if you can hear me.
Yes, he had a portrait in addition, he loved to tell students and professors when they were visiting Monticello, as well as other visitors, he loved to tell them anecdotes about Franklin. His two favorite personalities of the American Revolution to talk about were Franklin and George Washington. It has to be said, in many ways, he fell out with George Washington ultimately. He never fell out with Franklin. And so I suspect that in many ways he felt much warmer and more disposed to him. And he would not but have admired Franklin's work in science. Indeed, he upheld Franklin as an example of what America could achieve.
With Washington, but he always held Franklin in high regard. Why do you think that was?
Because they never fell out. He admired Franklin's work as a scientist. And of course, he admired Franklin very much as a politician. And when he went to Paris to succeed Franklin as ambassador to France, he essentially said, nobody could fill the shoes of Franklin. And Franklin, after all, was by far the best known American in Europe during the period of the American Revolution. And he was so popular that Wedgwood created little statuettes of him. He obviously wrote a lot in the British and French newspapers, and was a great personality who was liked at court in Versailles. That was something that Jefferson would have envied, the kind of influence that Franklin had with the French government, and how well Franklin was able to read negotiating with the French. For those who are familiar with the diplomacy of the American Revolution, there were several other diplomatic representatives sent to France from America, and the others were both resentful of Jefferson, of Franklin, like John Adams, and also attempting to intervene in their own clumsy way. Franklin was really a sort of master of manipulation and diplomacy.
I agree, without which we might have been Canada if he hadn't have used that charm and his diplomatic wiles to convince the French court to support the cause of revolution. But I have
that's a very important point. And it wasn't just French arms and the French Navy, but crucially French money that kept the revolution sustainable. And thanks to the anti-government ethos of the revolutionary ideology and to the failure of Congress to be able to tax people, the revolution could have gone bankrupt. And French money was essential in sustaining it.
Well, I want to tell you a question that Sami Pinarbasi has asked in the chat, and let me encourage others to think of interesting questions while you've got such a distinguished scholar here. And Sami wants to know, how much did it cost to attend such a university, and was it prohibitively expensive and thus an elitist pursuit?
So it was about $800 a year, and that made it the most expensive university in America other than Harvard. So yes, it was expensive, and that was very contrary to Jefferson's original vision. And it was partly because they just weren't getting enough money, public money, to fund students, and they did not have scholarships that he'd so wanted for the first 30 years of the university's existence. And even then, the number was very limited. And to a degree, the University of Virginia has always been one of the most private public universities in America. Most people are surprised when they even learn that it's a public university.
Catherine Netsch has asked about whether Jefferson set up a scholarship program.
He tried to, and the scholarships were not funded, but at least his vision of having scholarships was remained as part of the agenda of the university, and they did eventually introduce scholarships, but there were very few of them. Jefferson's thinking about education, many would say, was very elitist, but at least it contained, like Franklin, an element of meritocratic beliefs. He did think that ordinary and poor people had the potential, just as much as wealthy people, to be academic, and that they should be given opportunities. Obviously, because we're dealing with colleges, this was all males. There were no female students in America at the time that he established the university, although that very quickly developed thereafter, but still remained very limited for the first 40 years of the 19th century. But yes, he wanted there to be that opportunity for ordinary people and to become part of what he called a natural aristocracy. But nevertheless, he imagined that there would be a public school system and that would be there for boys and girls. And he brought forward a bill in 1779 for this, what he called a general diffusion of knowledge, so that there would be, for 3 years, boys and girls would be educated at the expense of the public. Then the very brightest of the boys, and this was going to be a very small number, would go on to academies, and then just a very few from throughout the state would go on to the university, being fully funded all the way by the state. And that latter part did not happen for 30 or 30 years or so after the founding.
And do you think he would have done something different given our historical hindsight?
Well, what he really would have wanted to do differently was to found more feed-in schools and to found a public school system. That he regarded as one of his great failures, even though he kept on trying and writing new bills. It never passed, but he recognized, in fact, he argued that that was much more important than a university. And if you had to choose between educating the population generally and just educating a few people extremely well, he favored public education at the earliest level because he felt it was essential that the future electorate be educated enough to be able to hold government accountable in elections. Part of the reason why his plans for public schools failed was that he didn't want the schools to employ any clergy or churchmen and to teach religion. And he opposed the one other public school bill put forward by a political opponent because he felt it was going to be controlled by mainly the Presbyterians. The Presbyterians in America were the most active religious group in founding colleges and founding schools. And Jefferson was highly suspicious of them because he felt that they, for one thing, wanted to gain conversions, that they would indoctrinate people and not encourage three-floor thought, and that they were not sufficiently supportive of what he regarded as modern education, like sciences.
Jason Durr asks a question, or did Sally Hemmings in any way influence Thomas Jefferson's education or university design? And that also leads me to ask a kind of peripheral question about how we balance or make sense of Jefferson's articulation of all men created equal with his position on slavery.
Unfortunately, we know very little about Sally Hemings. We know really nothing about Sally Hemings's views or their interactions. And it's the great unknown. It's just not recorded other than what we know from her son Madison Hemings and what he told us of the relationship and the sort of semi-contract that they made in Paris, in which she agreed to go back to America and not seek freedom in France as long as her children were eventually freed, and as long as she would be ultimately a free person. And Jefferson did adhere to that, and not only freed his children eventually, including the last of them just before he died, but he also arranged for them to be able to stay in Virginia, which was against the law. Virginia passed an act early in the 19th century that prohibited emancipated African Americans from living in Virginia. And he petitioned the legislature specifically to permit them to stay. Sally Hemmings was never given formal freedom, but she was given what was colloquially known as your time, and she moved immediately into Charlottesville, and to all intents and purposes was a free person, and was even listed as a free person in one of the censuses, even though there was never a formal arrangement. In terms of Jefferson's view of slavery, it's sometimes difficult to fully pin down his views. They were at times contradictory, but what has always impressed me is that he understood that slavery was what he called a moral abomination, and that unlike planters in the British Caribbean, he understood the conflict between freedom and slavery, and that he claimed to be, throughout his life, anti-slavery. There's a tendency now not to take that seriously or to see it as pure cynicism, but he did take direct measures against slavery, contrary to what some people say, that he never did anything. He wrote a Western ordinance which would have banned the expansion of slavery, not only into the Northwest, but also into the Southwest. That would have been huge, because the eventual Civil War was not fought over the continuation of slavery, but the ability of Western states to expand slavery into newly acquired territories. And Jefferson's law would have made that illegal. And the fact is that his ordinance inspired the Northwest Ordinance, which did indeed prohibit the expansion of slavery into the Northwest. So places like Iowa and Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan never formally had slavery, although there was a period in which those who were already there could remain before being freed, but it's essentially prohibited slavery in that area. Also, as president, he used the first opportunity allowed by the Constitution to ban the slave trade and encourage Congress to pass a measure. And the preamble of his message to Congress was very clear in condemning slavery. He famously said, that the American people had much to fear if God is just. He thought that unless slavery was removed, it would lead to a civil war. not least because of the resentment of formerly enslaved people.
DM Corbett is saying that DNA testing proved that Jefferson could not have fathered Hemmings' Paris-conceived child. Maybe that's a contentious point.
It is a contentious point, but the people who deny the relationship between Jefferson and Hemmings, of which there's a small group, especially here in Charlottesville, what they do is simply focus on the DNA evidence and say that it doesn't prove beyond all doubt that he fathered the children. The DNA evidence was only demonstrated for one of the children rather than all six. But the point is the DNA evidence is just part of the evidence that we based this view on, and it's become a consensus among professional historians. And the people who question it are a couple of law professors and then largely genealogists, but they're not known historians. The reason is because there is so much evidence to support it. One of the surprises to me when I was reading or working on the history of the university is that there was a very evangelical member of the board, John Hartwell Cock, who liked Jefferson and was an important ally in creating the university. And nevertheless, and not only was he appalled that it was a secular institution, but he complained that students were liaising with women of color and that they got their influence from Jefferson. The knowledge and claims about this relationship are frequent. John Quincy Adams, who later became President of the United States, composed a poem about the relationship. There were cartoons depicting it. John Adams, Jefferson's friend again in later life, wrote that as long as the name of Sally Hemmings is remembered, Jefferson has much to be worried about in terms of his posterity, how posterity would view him. And it was, of course, publicized in the newspapers. People always dismiss the source of it, his calendar, because he was famously drunk and produced lots of rumors and squibs. But the fact is, a lot of what he alleged was true. It may have been propaganda, it may have been done for political reasons. And this was so accepted that when Anthony Trollope's mother came to Virginia and wrote a book called Customs and Manners of Americans, she visited Charlottesville, and it was just a few years after Jefferson's death. And she said, I can't believe these people also admire Jefferson, knowing that he'd had relationships with his slaves. She made it plural. No one has, and what is interesting is that there was no woman in Jefferson's life after the death of his wife, which was while he was still in his 40s, and while he was living during the American Revolution. In fact, he was still virtually in his late 30s. No other woman was ever mentioned in his life other than Maria Cosway. And we don't know exactly what happened there, but she was a married woman with whom he had a flirtation. And we know that because we have their letters, and they would be regarded today as remarkably inappropriate. One of the letters that Jefferson wrote to her was called his Head and the Heart letter, has become known, because he subtitled each paragraph what the head was telling him, which was not to go any further, and what the heart was telling him. And indeed, he was someone who was always very attracted to women, especially intelligent women, and had tried to court a whole number of women before he married his wife, who died in 1782. And so you're basically suggesting, if he didn't have a relationship with Sally Hemmings, that he lived like a monk for the last half of his life.
Oh, let me just move on for a moment. I want a one-word answer for Catherine before I ask one of Eric Johnson's questions. Catherine wants to know, did Jefferson own the land where the university was situated?
No, he didn't. Interestingly, Madison had owned some of that land at one point, although they bought it from someone entirely independent who gave them the best offer. It was not the land that Jefferson had wanted, and he had to readapt his design for the university based on the location. But the person who made the offer was very smart, because he insisted on being basically a clerk of works when the university was being built, and that he get control of a lot of projects. I suspect he made a lot more money ultimately by that agreement, but Jefferson, of course, was keen to keep costs down originally and wanted to build as much of the university as possible in order to get the public to adopt it. The university began as a defunct school called Albemarle Academy that only existed on paper. Jefferson took over this project and immediately turned it into what he called Central College, which was part of a propaganda publicity campaign to make the case that Charlottesville was the most central part of Virginia. And he wanted to build as much of it as possible so that when the legislature, the state legislature, considered building a university, his would seem the natural place, and it would have all the promise of being completed because some of it was already up.
Let me ask you this final question, so we'll need to be brief. We're almost out of time. You just mentioned, Eric said at that point, there was less monetary support from the legislature for the university in its early years than Jefferson had wanted. Were there challenges for Jefferson in working with legislators or other public figures in Virginia to establish the university?
There was considerable opposition, and it was on many levels. There were, of course, members of the Federalist Party, which was the opposing political party in the legislature, people in the western parts of the state, which was fortunately for him underrepresented. They tended to be opposed to him, partly because a lot of them were Scotch-Irish Presbyterians who were opposed to the secular character of the university. So the fact that the university would not teach religion, that was a major reason for opposition. But the location in Charlottesville was another reason. William and Mary College wanted to become the main university of Virginia. So did what is now called Washington and Lee College. They put a bid in, and the town of Stanton also wanted to house the main university, as did Richmond. And then there was a lot of opposition to the pure cost of the university.
Okay, well, I think we could go on asking you many more questions because it's absolutely fascinating. I didn't get through all of mine, but I want to thank you so much, Andrew, for an absolutely fascinating picture of Jefferson and this kind of least known thing about him. It's really something that we don't often think about, is his contribution to education. So you have to come back and tell us more in due course. Let me just flag that our next book club is going to be taking place with, bear with me, I'm just going to get all the right information. It is going to be featuring S.I. Martin. He's going to be talking about the incomparable world. This will be taking place on the 26th of October. And he's going to be showcasing his work, which is about untold stories of African-American soldiers in 1780s London grappling with their post-war freedom. So that sounds very interesting, and hopefully you will join us. But thank you so much once again to Andrew Jackson O'Shaughnessy, and thank you to all of you for taking your time to be with us.
Thank you, and I'm sorry about stable connection. I think that was at my end rather than yours.
We made it. We made it through.
Yes, thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.